Hi.
How
Mr.
are you?
Salim. Hi, I'm fine. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your supporting my country. For me, it's important to speak with you not only as a president of Danube Institute in Budapest, but also as a outstanding personality of the British journalist history, I would say. UK, our top ally, maybe, in according with the United States, I mean. And I have several questions.
Yeah.
They are quite complicated questions. However, I will ask you.
Yeah.
Because you see history from your personal point of view.
Yeah.
You remember outstanding personalities like Margaret Thatcher. You worked with her.
Yeah.
So we actually now in new maybe preface of new Cold War. I don't know. And my question: if the war will continue in the next 2 years, what developments we can see? So what will be in the future?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind remarks. Being English, of course, I can't possibly accept such praise, but it's great pleasure to be able to talk to you about the situation. Now, I don't know how the war is going to end, partly because one never knows how these conflicts end, and partly because at the moment it does seem to be something like a stalemate, with neither side winning nor losing, but the marginal gains being made by Ukrainian forces. And of course, all of the discussions we're having about the future of the war in Ukraine depend upon the behavior, the success or failure of the Ukrainian army. Mm-hmm. If it weren't for that success, we wouldn't have these debates and discussions. And now, as I say, I can't predict how it will end, but I assume it will end with ceasefire and negotiations. And what will then be the key issue is what is the state of military affairs on the ground mm-hmm. when the ceasefire is called. Mm-hmm. Obviously, from a Ukrainian standpoint, you would like to regain as much of the territory you lost since 2014. When that happens, equally, the Russians want the reverse. They want to have an even larger chunk of Ukraine than they possess today. And that itself will determine whether or not a ceasefire is going to be held, is going to take place and hold. My feeling is a pessimistic one in one sense. Mm-hmm. I think the war will possibly go on for a long time, because unless one side is clearly beginning to break through and win, the other side doesn't have the incentive to reach a deal, and at this point neither side has a strong enough incentive. I hope that changes, and I hope it changes obviously in a pro-Ukrainian direction, but that is up to the Ukrainian forces on the ground.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're absolutely right that the situation, if you speak about the front line, yeah. and a lot of political things depend on the front line. Yeah. However, the success of Ukrainian armed forces also depend on the level of support of Western countries, of yes. NATO. What do you see, what maybe insiders or insights you see inside NATO if we speak about the future support of Ukraine? Because I see that there is some kind of lack maybe of unanimous decision. I see that there is some kind of serious, maybe splitted decision concerning the support of NATO. What do you feel inside?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't underestimate the political importance of the fact that the day after the invasion, the whole of NATO unified and has taken a strong line since then. How long will that line hold? Well, let me make 2 points. First, in a long war, there is always some attrition of support. Mm-hmm. But that can be quite a long time. People point to the American war in Vietnam and say that in the end they gave way, which is true. But they actually fought for 10 years, and they extended for another 3 years an assistance from the air, which maintained the independence of South Korea. So there wasn't a collapse early on, it went on for some time. The second is, of course, you're correct to say that within NATO and within the EU, both of which are very large coalitions of nations, mm-hmm. You already have some different kinds of alliances forming.
Yeah.
I think that I would specify two in particular. One is that the French, the Germans, and other countries, Hungary in particular, have essentially formed a policy which is to look for and encourage a ceasefire and negotiations as soon as is reasonably possible. Obviously, there are differences between them as when that might be. The second is essentially the UK, the US, Poland, Ukraine itself, the Baltic states, Sweden, and probably Norway. They are united around a desire to inflict defeat upon Russia sufficiently extensive as to persuade, as to push the Russians to accepting a non-imperial version of their country's role in the world. How long that might take, it's hard to know. And it's hard to know because at the moment in Russia, there are actual penalties attached to disagreeing with Mr. Putin's regime and with the special military operation. But it will, for some time, a lot will depend on how long support holds in Russia for the war. But while it holds, then I think, yes, we have to prepare for some countries arguing more strongly, leaving the second camp and going into the first. And I think that's a real problem for Ukraine. But there's another factor, which is the behavior of the Russians in the war has been, by the normal standards of modern political life, disgraceful. It's been war crimes and worse than war crimes. And that will be a solid factor within Western countries, keeping them on in support of the war, because there is in America and Britain a surprisingly wide support for the war, and I think in other countries too, particularly Northern European countries. So I don't expect an early dissipation of NATO support.
It's good. However, you mentioned Putin's regime. You mentioned the situation inside Russian Federation, because after the recent developments with Wagner Group, a lot of experts anticipated that something would change. I did not anticipate some kind of changes inside political system, because some experts here, even in Transylvania, in Tushvanya, they think that in the future there will be some change of political situation inside Russia, and it could change something geopolitically. What do you anticipate and expect in the regarding of the current future Russia situation?
Whatever I say, please bear in mind the rule is that nobody can foretell the future. Right?
Yes, I know.
Now, that said, Mr. Putin has been depending upon the willingness of the Russians to absorb more pain than anything that the West might inflict upon them. That's not my speculation. That's exactly what he told an international conference back in the first decade of this century. And he did so brutally and very effectively. And I think a lot of people in the West accept the truth of that. Now, the problem is that in regimes like his, everything looks solid and stable and dependable and trustworthy until suddenly they don't. You never know when that moment is going to be, but of course all bad things come to an end, and we should recognize that. And then secondly, of course, you're right to point out the rebellion by the Wagner Group. There's an element of theatre there, and of course they're still supporting the Russian war from Belarus. But having said that, I don't think it was totally planned. I think it disturbed the Russians, and it's very alarming to I think a lot of people, the idea that a private army can in fact get to within 100 kilometers of Moscow, and there didn't seem to be any way of stopping them except their decision to halt it. It reminds me, if you will, just before the end of the Cold War, when a small biplane flew all the way and landed in Red Square.
Fisher. He
Yeah.
was like his Fisher.
Yeah, that's right. And suddenly everybody said, these people are not as sharp in terms of electronic and other defenses as we thought. And in general, I would say, people in Western Europe, one major change has occurred in Western opinion, and that is we're not as frightened of Russia as we were before. Maybe we should be more frightened, but we're not.
It's very, very difficult to not to agree with you because you're operating facts. By the way, you are absolutely right that it's very complicated, difficult to foresee the future. Your compatriot Bertrand Russell, is in 60s said that if you want to make some kind of analysis, you always have to take into account the facts.
Yes.
Facts.
Yeah.
This is very important. And my fourth question concerning the facts analysis of Hungarian foreign policy and Hungarian-Ukrainian relations. It's complicated topic, even for me, for Ukrainian. However, since 2017, you worked in that Danube Institute.
2013.
13, you work and you know the Budapest, you know Hungarian foreign policy. So, what are the obstacles for Hungarian government to strengthen the support of Ukraine? I mean, the possible weapon supply. What are the obstacles? What we can do, maybe to persuade them to operate more, courageously or more with more conviction, more level of support.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, quote Bertrand Russell, who once said that the existence of something is absolute proof of its possibility.
Oh, it's very philosophical.
So you have a Hungarian foreign policy which is rooted in the national interest. That's what Orban says, and I think he's telling the truth. Secondly, it's also rooted in political reality. I think there is no doubt, and friends of mine who visited Poland, for example, and then came here to cover the last election, said the atmosphere in the two countries is extraordinarily different. In Poland, people would rush up to American soldiers and thank them for being there and helping Ukraine.
Yeah.
In this country, people would come and say, I hope there's not going to be a war. Tell you to a foreign correspondent, tell me we're not going to get involved in a war. Now, that's a perfectly legitimate expression of Hungarian national interest. And I would say, too, that there are lots of ways, most obvious one being the acceptance of millions of refugees who've not always stayed here, but were received here and welcomed and so on, is a factor in this as well. And I think we must put that on the creditable side of the legislature. Also, neither of us, I think, would deny a background of bad relations between Hungary and Ukraine over language policy and other things. And I'm not an expert in that, but I think everyone would agree that the Ukrainians are not entirely innocent, to put it low higher. So all of those are factors. Where I think I would say that I disagreed with, where I would be very critical of the government, would be, I think, its rhetorical stance on Ukraine has been weaker than it should have been. Yes, the government has said on a number of occasions that it completely condemns the Russian invasion, which is contrary to all of the promises that the Soviet Union and every country has made in relation to maintaining peace and defense. And I think they could have expressed that rather more firmly and clearly and more repeatedly than they have. Why haven't they done so? I think because at the moment they pinned a lot of their hopes on better economic relations with the East. I don't just mean with Russia. I mean with China and with the rest of the world. And the war Global South. The war really disturbs that probability because of sanctions. I would say that they have in fact observed all the sanctions that NATO and the EU have imposed. Yes, they've complained about it and so on. But then I would say to the international community, and particularly to the EU, If you think the Hungarians should behave more altruistically in relation to this war, why do you treat them in relation to their own society to a kind of imperious schoolmaster approach of instructing them to believe in the latest woke fashions of the New York intelligentsia? It makes no sense, and that is why I think it's understandable that the Hungarian community is divided, as all are, but it is very strong in favor of the government's policy. And that policy has costs for Hungary, the principal one being that it's alienating its most important ally, Poland, in all of these other battles. So that's what I would say. It's a mixed bag. You can see why it's doing it. I think its overall judgment is wrong, and its rhetorical expression should be stronger.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your answers. Thanks for your support. And I think everything will be good if we together.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nice
you.
meeting you. Cheers.